That relates directly to the second reason for opposition. Some don't think there is a need for safe access zones. Presiding Officer, as I recently told committee, I wholeheartedly wish that was so. But too many have brought forward testimony that says otherwise, and I will share a couple of examples. From a woman responding to my consultation, there's this harrowing account, and I quote, "When walking into the clinic, I had two large older men screaming at me, calling me names. I had no one with me and no one to defend me when I was in no fit mental state to defend myself." She goes on to say, "Because of their cruel words during such a horrific and vulnerable time in my life, I carried that guilt for years." And from Professor Sharon Cameron, who gave evidence to committee, women attending clinics have clearly been distressed, while others have been phoning up in advance of a consultation, anxious about entering the building and worried about protesters and perhaps media. Feedback that we got at the time was that they were feeling targeted, anxious and harassed. Staff are also anxious and concerned about patients being put off attending services, and the situation has resulted in additional workload. And I urge anyone who doubts the bill's necessity to reflect on those testimonies. Attending any unfamiliar medical
beliefs. Presiding Officer, during our scrutiny, we heard evidence that activity by those opposed to abortion had increased outside clinics in Scotland in recent years. We heard about activity occurring outside a number of premises in Scotland, and we have taken extensive evidence from both those who have been affected by activities outside abortion services and from those engaging in those matter. Finally, Presiding Officer, the issue of silent prayer was one that came up on various occasions during the taking of evidence, and indeed, as noted in the committee report, led to a difference in views being held by the committee. On a personal level, I am reassured by the member's provision of clarity in her letter to the committee, and I know that she will work with others to make sure that we get this right. The member has been very helpful when discussing. In concluding, Presiding Officer, I once again reiterate Scottish Labour's support for this bill at stage 1 and commit my party to working with Gillian Mackay to improve the legislation in many of the areas that members have spoken about so far, and I'm sure will go on to speak about, to make sure this legislation enters the next stages in a cross-party way as possible. The bill is clearly required to protect women's access to these services. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Mock. Accept their premise that it is prayer, not protest, that they are engaging in. And that's because I want to talk about the Christian theological dimension to this. Not all at these vigils are Christians, but the vast majority are. Those who gave evidence to us were. And it's important to understand the motivation of those engaging in behaviour that we are seeking to prevent and displace. Bishop Keenan from the Catholic Church explained the importance of prayer to Christians, and I agree. But his evidence and that of others strayed between prayer and preaching, and that engages different rights and different questions of faith. Christians are called to spread what we consider to be the good news, but we're explicitly not called to pray performatively in public. Jesus is actually really specific about that. Just before introducing the Lord's Prayer, he said, "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." That's in Matthew chapter 6, for anybody who wants to do a bit of further reading. The presiding officer was presented with a lovely new parliamentary Bible last week. The Act, having come into force across the UK almost 60 years ago, it's still a deeply politicised area of healthcare. The organisations who put together anti-abortion protests in Scotland have been repeatedly found to spread dangerously false claims, including that abortion increases your chance of breast cancer. Utterly, utterly false. They say that both sides of this debate must be heard. Well, clearly there are two well-understood sides of the moral argument, but the provision of health advice is for healthcare professionals. It is not a space for political debate. That can and does take place elsewhere. Presiding Officer.
Now I'm proud to call my friends, and it's young women like Alice Murray and Lily Roberts, just two of the women who have shared their stories bravely with the public and with Parliament, stories of running that gauntlet and facing the loud chants or the silent judgment. It doesn't matter how quiet or noisy it is, assessing or involved in the provision of healthcare. So at the heart of this, there are really important issues of bodily autonomy and of access to sexual and reproductive rights. And I am very clear that gendered harassment and intimidation is a form of violence against women and girls, and it has to end. Excuse me, I'm struggling with a sore throat today. So I've made the points about workers, about trade unions, and about everyone being able to come to Parliament and have their say. I also want to mention in the final seconds Dr Greg Irwin, who's been a real ally to the campaigners. He's a paediatric radiologist working in the Royal Hospital for Children in Glasgow, and he's talked often about the visible nature of the protests and the noise and people within the hospital environment, even though it's a big hospital, can hear it. He's talked about the bullying of women in NHS hospitals today, and that can't go on. And I will agree with colleagues that no bill at stage 1 is ever complete or the finished article. So I welcome the ongoing scrutiny of this bill. I'm happy to play my part, but I would really urge all colleagues to back the bill at stage 1 tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Lennon.
And 5 intend to operate. Second, removing silent prayer could also have the unintended consequence of exempting other conduct that accompanied it, which could remove the operational discretion that's so vital in protecting both women and staff. Providing an exemption to continue the presence and behaviours that we know are intimidating undermines the bill entirely and betrays the testimony we've heard throughout this process. I invite any member who would like to understand this in more depth to contact me for a ballot of disapproval and judgment.